Hello, I'm Jonathan Friedman, Admissions Director and Associate Professor at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. An important aspect of IISHJ is providing adult learning opportunities and resources along with our professional training programs and publications. Along those lines, it's a pleasure to be talking today with Martin DiMaggio. Martin graduated as an officiant from IISHJ in May 2024. He's a leader for the Spinoza Havurah, an online international humanistic Jewish community, and recently co-founded HJUK, Humanistic Judaism UK. He has a master's in linguistics and specializes in minority and endangered languages, and also has a degree in anthropology, as well as an adult education qualification and a community development qualification. He comes from a mixed Anglo-Italian-Albanian family and has a keen interest in Jewish liturgy. Great to talk to you, Martin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So could you share a little bit more about your Jewish background and maybe how you found your way to humanistic Judaism?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town near a small city, near Birmingham, which is the second city of the UK, which itself only has population of 1 million. And really, there were only about 5 Jewish families, most of whom were mixed in that town. So every now and then we would drive up to Birmingham, mainly about 3 times a year, high holidays, etc. And it was a bit of a sort of shul hopping, we say in the UK. Sort of skipping between different synagogues. There were only 3 to choose from, all of whom were Orthodox. And it wasn't also, I thought, and it wasn't until I was in my sort of early teens that I realized there was a liberal synagogue. So liberal Judaism in the UK is a denomination, which is similar to American Reform. Our Reform is similar to conservative. Yeah. It's kind of a bit complicated. So I tend to say that I grew up in a sort of liberal Jewish environment, and there were other influences in there as well. Other families that I knew were Italian, Iraqi, and Moroccan. So I didn't even know that Jews ate salmon until I was like 12 years old. So that's really kind of a little bit about sort of my background in terms of my exposure to Judaism as a child. But then it wasn't until I was about 21 years old that I discovered Sherwin Wine's book, Judaism Beyond God. And that really kind of led me down a positive rabbit hole, if that's such a thing, to learning about humanistic Judaism. And I wouldn't say that I was automatically humanistic. I was quite traditional as a teenager. I would take myself to synagogue. Actually, one of the liberal Jewish rabbis in the UK, she remembered me. I hadn't seen her for maybe 30 years, and she remembered me at an event and said, "Are you the one that used to bring his dad to shul?" So it was quite the opposite of what it usually is. But as I started reading Rabbi Sherwin Wine's book, it kind of resonated with me and my worldview, and it's been quite a journey. And during my 20s, I would say that I was very religious, very observant, we tend to say in the UK. But I did that with humanistic words, which is quite I tend to say I'm humanistic, and yeah, I would still say I am.
Yeah, that does seem to be something of an outlier in my own experience leading humanistic Jewish communities in the States. People tend to not be so liturgically inclined. So your interest in liturgical Judaism, as it were, is maybe a novelty in some sense in the Jewish spaces that you now inhabit. And also, I know that you're critical of what some call Ashkenormativity in these Jewish spaces. So, what does that term mean? And how is maybe Ashkenormativity an impediment to appreciating and experiencing Jewish diversity in our world today?
Yeah, so Ashkenormativity is basically a concept that says that Ashkenazi culture, Ashkenazi experiences or perspectives tend to be centered and normalized in Jewish spaces, which often results in sort of marginalization or othering of Sephardic, Mizrahi, and other Jewish identities and experiences. Within this kind of phenomenon, Ashkenazi traditions are seen as the standard or the norm. And I would say this is particularly true, unfortunately, of liberal Jewish spaces, of what we call progressive Judaism in the UK, which I think you also do in the States, Corgeda. So I think that within progressive spaces, due to the demographics, or is it like which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it because of the demographics that Ashkenazi culture is centered, or is it because of the centering that the demographics are the way that they are? Ashkenormativity tends to limit our recognition and understanding of Jewish diversity. So even when people speak of Sephardim, they tend to think of quote unquote Oriental Jews, which is what the term Mizrahi means. People will conflate Mizrahi and Sephardi, not understanding that there are, of course, Western Sephardim, particularly in the UK. And there's a writer called Lulwa Khazzoom, who is an Iraqi-American Jewish woman. And she wrote a book called The Flying Camel, which addresses this particular sort of concept and the way it affects Arab Jewish women. And even that idea, Arab and Jewish, it's also kind of, you know, mind-blowing to some people that there is such a thing. She talks about experiences of growing up in the United States and going to a local Jewish event, probably the only synagogue that was near her, and then doing the ululation, which is a gruta in Arabic, and people looking at her with shock and asking if she's Palestinian, and you know, as if Jews don't do this, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I think there's another way we can be critical of this concept of Ashkenormativity as well, and that's from the Ashkenazic approach, because part of what you're implying and part of what I've seen is kind of a de-regionalization, a homogenization of Ashkenazic culture, as if, you know, all Ashkenazi Jews are also the same. And in the similar way that you're saying, when we think Sephardic, we might have a stereotype in mind. I think it goes kind of both ways, but just kind of elevating and raising to the surface the idea of a normativity of any kind should cause us to question what does that mean? Why is there this kind of assumed normativity, and what are the layers beneath? And that kind of diversity that you're alluding to, I think, is right under the surface of that stereotyping, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I tend to write culture square brackets S.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's Jewish
reason.
cultures, Jewish ethnicities, Judaisms. You know, we could add an S to basically everything.
Yeah, right.
So getting back to the UK, Jews were officially readmitted to England, as I understand, in the 17th century after being expelled way back in 1290. And this project of readmittance was initially Sephardic Jews, was it not?
Yeah, it first happened in around about the 1650s, and it was Oliver Cromwell, who for many people was not a good character, but he overthrew the monarchy and instituted the Commonwealth of England. And it was due to him and his dealings with a rabbi from the Netherlands that Sephardim from the Netherlands were admitted to the UK. And people also get a bit confused about that as well, because I have some ancestry going back to those Spanish and Portuguese Jews from the Netherlands. And people get very confused and say, sorry, are you Dutch or are you Italian or what are you? So yeah, it was people who had a few generations or a couple of generations before, or even people whose grandparents and parents in some cases had come from Portugal particularly, but also Spain, that had settled in the Netherlands because of the Inquisition or the early expulsion of Jews. And many people became conversos or new Christians and had basically lived in Catholic countries, hiding the fact that they were Jewish, or crypto Jews in wider culture. And yeah, there were a group of those people that were admitted to the UK. Baruch Spinoza's relatives were among some of them. And basically there's been a continuous, so the oldest and most continuous synagogue in the UK is Bevis Marks, which was founded in 1701, which doesn't have electricity, and all the services on Friday nights are candlelit and everything. Yeah, that's really the oldest. We can say now that that's the oldest Jewish community in the UK. And it wasn't until the 19th century, I believe, the late 19th century, early 20th century, that Ashkenazim started to arrive. I believe mainly from Germany originally. So it was kind of Western Sephardim and Western Yiddish speakers that formed the basis of the UK Jewish community.
It's really interesting. There's a parallel history, as you probably know, in the United States with colonial America. The first Jews to arrive were also Spanish Portuguese from Amsterdam by way of Brazil. And really, up until the 19th century, the Sephardic rite, the Sephardic culture was a dominant Jewish culture in the very small Jewish community in the US. So much so that if you were a Jew from elsewhere in Europe coming to the US to kind of flip things around, you would have to adopt Sephardic practice in order to kind of engage in Jewish communal ritual. Nowadays, when you're talking about Ashkenormativity, it's sort of the other way around. If you happen to be a Sephardic Jew, because of demographics, because of the majority culture, you basically have to, in many cases, sort of abide by the Ashkenormative rite, as it were, just kind of function as an Ashkenazi Jew.
Right, yeah. And it's ironic because I mentioned that I feel this is particularly problematic in progressive Jewish spaces where perhaps I'd expect more. Because Reform Judaism and liberal Judaism in the UK has a history of the Sephardi community and the Ashkenazi community coming together. The West London Synagogue is the oldest functioning Reform synagogue in the UK that was founded as not as a Reform synagogue, but as a Reform by a Sephardi community that joined forces with a German. So it's a Sephardi British community that joined forces with a German community. And Claude Montefiore was an Anglo-Italian Sephardi Jew. And he's basically one of the main founders of Reform Judaism. And then there was Lily Montague, who was of German origin.
It's often the case that, if anything, Jews in Ashkenazi-dominated spaces will add a token Ladino song to their gatherings, or add hummus and pita to their buffet tables, really with the superficial intention of doing something a little bit different. But you caution that, quote, it's not appropriate to enjoy the so-called exotic music, foods, and other practices of a minority and ignore the issues of exclusion faced by such communities. Minorities are not theater, they're not tourist attractions, and they must not be treated as such. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, a good example of this occurring in context that I've seen is Mimuna. Mimuna is the end of Pesach, which is predominantly celebrated by North African Maghrebi Jews, but also Jews from Gibraltar, which Gibraltar is very close to Morocco and has had a continuous Jewish community for 300 years. And as it's a UK overseas territory, has a lot of links with the Western Sephardi community in London. So many people, are familiar with Memuna in British Sephardi context. But in the larger Jewish community, it tends to be seen as somewhat of an excuse to celebrate Moroccan Jewish culture. And I've seen this taking all kinds of forms, like having hired henna artists, and I've even seen a belly dancer at one event. Things that wouldn't happen in an organically Sephardi Memuna celebration. And it's very rarely treated as a sort of spiritual or religious or Jewish even event. It's like, yeah, it's that kind of exotic Jewish thing from Morocco. That's how people seem to see it, and it's even taking the form nowadays of a sort of interfaith celebration where local Muslim communities are invited to come and share in this kind of celebration. And very rarely are Moroccan Jews involved in this, and very, very rarely are even Sephardim involved. And I have myself been asked to lead a Memuna service or co-lead a Memuna service. Or so I thought. And then actually what I was actually being asked to do was kind of give some background and then write something in Ladino. And I said, but Moroccan Jews don't speak Ladino. Some like North Moroccan Jews who are actually Sephardi will speak Hakatiya and certainly do celebrate Memuna. But why are we including Ladino? It just doesn't make sense. And yeah, even the fact that many Moroccan Jews feel that why is our culture being hijacked this way? And other things, I've many times been asked to, oh, Martin can sing En Keloenu, or, Non como nuestro Señor, this song. And, and I've been asked to do that in liberal Jewish spaces, or, oh, Martin can read this, oh, Martin can sing Bendigamos, and it's like, yeah, I can, and I love to, but there's many other things that I would love to include in my progressive Jewish spaces that doesn't get included.
Yeah, so I think getting beyond the tokenism and the stereotyping, for some reason, in my mind, I'm thinking of a parallel in cinema history of Native Americans on screen who never existed in real life. They're only a cinematic version, usually a very terrible version of a reality. And I think there is that maybe even well-meaning impulse in some Jewish communities to honor, but in you're honoring, you're basically insulting in that way. So if, a community wants to go a little bit deeper, what would you say to an Ashkenazi Jew who might feel uncomfortable adopting or really diving into a Sephardic or Mizrahi custom, maybe sensing that this is a form of cultural appropriation?
Yeah, well, I feel that very often, and this perhaps doesn't apply so much to humanistic Jews, but very often people will say, oh, Pesach is so hard, I think I'll go Sephardi this year. Again, as if Sephardi is just one thing, because the rules about what you can eat in Pesach are, less stringent in Sephardi, most Sephardi contexts. But if somebody genuinely wanted to adopt a Sephardi practice and did so respectfully and researched it and was aware of the idea of cultural appropriation, I don't believe there's anything wrong with that. And I know that the Sephardi community in the UK has many Ashkenazi congregants, And you know, there's been a long history actually for the last 100 years or more of Ashkenazim being members of the Spanish and Portuguese community and adopting its norms. And there are Ashkenazi names which are part of the Spanish and Portuguese community now. And also to remember that Am Echad, so Jews are one people essentially, within which is a huge array of diversity, but we are one people, and we have always thought of ourselves as one people. And so within that context, it's the norm for Jews to be able to adopt practices and traditions of other Jews, if done so respectfully and genuinely, and with authenticity.
Yeah, that authenticity part is, I think, the key as well, of like getting over the appropriation and into the realm of appreciation, and really learning and embedding oneself within a community that you might view as, you know, other, make it less other, and become a part of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned things going both ways before, which I completely agree with. And you know, there was a time that I asked a progressive community in the UK if they might include Mimuna and Sigid and other celebrations as part of the calendar, the Jewish calendar, because of course they don't tend to be listed as Jewish festivals or holidays. And the response that somebody said to me was, "Oh, I don't think we would be very comfortable appropriating something like Mimuna." And I said, kind of instinctively, "Well, why is it okay for me to appropriate Ashkenazi all the time?" You know, which is not appropriation in that context. But I sometimes feel a bit like, well, you're assuming that Ashkenazi is the norm, so you don't think of it as appropriation when you're asking me to do something Ashkenazi. That can work the other way too.
Yeah, I know. And again, we overlook rivalries and conflicts even within Ashkenazi communities in the past. You know, the Central European German-speaking Jews didn't much care for the, you know, so-called backwards Eastern European Jews. And there are all kinds of conflicts that have been sort of resolved over years through relationships and through integration. And this would just be another logical step along that very natural process.
Right.
So what are some ways that you found success integrating non-Ashkenazi elements and customs into progressive and humanistic Jewish spaces?
Yeah, so I have led Mimuna celebrations, which did not include belly dancers. And you know, there's a table that's laid out for Mimuna with symbolic foods on it, which meant most Jews are familiar with the concept of a table with symbolic foods, right? Most people are familiar with Tu B'Shvat, which is itself basically a Sephardi tradition. So I've had success with including it in that context. But also on the online community that I'm part of and a leader of, very early on, I just kind of suggested in the leadership group, I would like to lead Mimuna, I would like to lead other things like a Rosh Hashanah Seder, which we would say Seder, not Seder. And we also had a service in honor of Sigurd. And I was particularly careful with Sigurd because I don't have any experience of celebrating it. But we did, I believe we did it in a very respectful way, and we just kind of introduced people to the Ethiopian Jewish community. And I found some videos of speakers from those communities talking about what Sigurd means for them. But particularly the Rosh Hashanah Seder, I've had a lot of success here, introducing people to that. And I can show you what it looks like. So people are probably not familiar with what a Rosh Hashanah Seder is, even to begin with. But basically, it's again a seder with symbolic foods, which actually dates back to the Talmud, where the remnant of it in Ashkenazi spaces is the apples and honey. but that's only one of the symbols of it. So I'll show you what it looks like. It's Yehi Ratzones is because the blessings are Yehi Ratzon, may it be so that. So it's called for many people Yehi Ratzones Seder or a Seder Simanim. The Seder means Simanim means symbols, and it's humanistic. So I'm not using the traditional theistic language. So I'm saying Baruch Or B'Masoret. Hanoten lanu sason v'simcha v'hadlakat ner shel Rosh Hashanah. So blessed is the tradition which gives us joy and happiness in kindling the Rosh Hashanah lights. And then underneath is the Ladino for that as well. So I'm not centering only Hebrew. It's using Ladino and Hebrew because I believe that Jewish languages are part of this process, and we need to center other languages other than Hebrew. So here we have the tipping the challah. This is, I think, familiar to lots of people on Rosh Hashanah. Again, it's got Ladino blessing. And then there's the apples and honey, again, familiar to most people. But then we move on to dates that have a symbolic meaning. So dates represent our wish for peace. The Hebrew word for date is tamar, and is related to the word tam, which means to end. So we hope for an end to hatred and strife in the world. And then again, the titles of each page use the Ladino word for the symbol. And with this date, there's quite a funny tradition where when we invite people to a Rosh Hashanah Seder, we give single people a date and we say, may your year be full of dates.
Nice.
With the wish that you will not be single. Yeah, and it moves on. So there's beans that have may our merits be bountiful like beans. There's granada or pomegranates, which we say there's a tradition that the pomegranate has 613 seeds. Nobody's ever counted them, but this obviously symbolizes the mitzvot, which we can reinterpret as good deeds or obligations as well. Then there's the pumpkin, leeks. For some reason, I thought you called it something else. I'm not sure why. And normally there's a fish head, but I use artichoke head. And artichokes are particularly symbolic of within the Italian Jewish community, because of the association with Jerusalem. There's a Jerusalem artichoke. So the head of an artichoke represents may we be heads and not tails. And then there's a song in Ladino by Sara Aroeste. And this blessing, Tichle Shana Vekileloteha, Tahel Shana Uvirchoteha, may this year with all its misfortunes cease and the new year with its blessings now begin. It's very, very common among Sephardim to say that at Rosh Hashanah. Birkat Hamazon, it's a translation of Bendigamos that I wrote with a humanistic language. And then afterwards, blessings that may have some questions involved in it. And then a little drash at the end. And then the greeting that many Sephardim uses, Añada buena, dulce y alegre. For many Spanish speakers, there are any Spanish speakers watching, they probably know what that means. But spoiler, it's may you have a sweet and good new year. Yeah, that's basically become our tradition on my online community for the past 2 or 3 years. When Rosh Hashanah comes, that's what we do. And it's well received. People take pictures of how they do it, and each person does it in their own unique way, and that's completely fine. And I think it's a nice way to expose people to something other than the high holiday services that a lot of people complain about often.
Yeah, I can imagine people having cans of baked beans and,
Yeah,
jars of artichoke hearts and things like that, whatever you can
I've
find.
seen that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does this project and maybe some of the other work that you're doing reflect humanistic Jewish values specifically?
Yeah, so I believe that celebrating Jewish diversity, celebrating diversity in itself generally, combating racism, combating any normativity of this kind that marginalizes some groups and gives the more power or centers other people is in itself a humanistic endeavor. Um, if you look at the commitments of humanism and of humanistic Judaism, is to value others, to foster unity between different communities, etc., etc. I very much believe that doing this kind of work is humanistic.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's sometimes said that doing interfaith or interreligious work is easier than doing intra-religious work because it's easier to sort of deal with and converse with people who are different than you are from the outside. But when you're looking at differences within your community, it can get very complicated. We have these personal connections. We have this, bag of assumptions that we make about what is Jewish and what isn't. And that goes both ways. I'm sure a lot of the things that Ashkenazi Jews do seem very exotic and foreign and strange to other kinds of Jews. But you're right. I mean, looking for the diversity that we have inside our own Jewish world is really powerful. And I think it makes us feel a little more connected to the broader world as well. I think Jews often feel marginalized and as minorities in whatever place they may be. It's a way to connect to Jews all around the world as well.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, the fact that I include Ladino in most of my services that I lead and in my writing means that we have people who speak Spanish or Portuguese feeling a little bit more connected, and
Right.
they come to us and they say, "Oh, I'd like to read that," and they might not always get the pronunciation quite there, but because Ladino is a different language, but it's a bridge, you know. They see something of their native language in that.
Well, thank you so much, Martin, for sharing with us.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to our audience for watching.